The air smelled of damp moss and pine resin as the 5 patrol cars made their way through the winding roads of the Black Forest. It was shortly after midnight, and the fog crept between the trees like a living creature. The small town of Waldkirch was already fast asleep. Only the police station still glowed with its cold neon lights in the darkness. Inside, the usual mood prevailed after a long shift. Fatigue mixed with a certain relief that another day had come to an end without any major incidents. But for 5 officers, the night was far from over. Jonas Müller, a burly man in his early 40s with greying hair and a scar above his left eye, leaned against his locker and grinned broadly. He had been with the police for 20 years and enjoyed the respect that his years of service had earned him. Next to him stood Sebastian Weber, slim and nervous, always careful not to lose the favor of his older colleagues. The two waited for the others. Felix Hoffmann was next to arrive, a man with broad shoulders and a laugh that was too loud for the late hour. Then Tobias Keller appeared, the youngest of the group, only 3 years on the force, but already fully initiated into the unwritten rules of the clique. Finally, Ayana Kone came through the door. She was the only one among them whose presence still created a certain tension. Ayana had been transferred from Freiburg to Waldkirch 8 months ago, a young woman with dark skin who immediately stood out in this small, predominantly white community. Her parents had come to Germany from the Ivory Coast long before she was born. Ayana spoke perfect German without any accent and had studied law in Freiburg before joining the police force. But in Waldkirch, she was not judged by her abilities, but by her origins. The looks she received were rarely neutral. Some were curious, others suspicious, some openly hostile. But the 4 men she was with today seemed to have accepted her. They laughed with her, shared beer after their shift, invited her to their private gatherings. Ayana had vowed to belong, whatever the cost. Jonas slapped her on the shoulder a little too hard, as always. "Well, Ayana, ready for our little tradition?" There was an undertone in his voice that she couldn't quite place. She smiled and nodded, even though her stomach was in knots. This tradition, as they called it, took place once a month. The men met after the late shift in an old hunting lodge deep in the woods, far from civilization. There they drank, played cards, told crude jokes, and did things that were not talked about. It was only Ayana's 2nd time there. The first time, everything had been harmless, or at least that's what she had told herself, but today she sensed a different energy in the air. The men's glances were more intense, their jokes sharper, their touches more intrusive. The drive to the cabin took just under 30 minutes. They drove in 2 cars, Ayana sitting in the back with Jonas and Sebastian. The roads grew narrower and narrower, the trees closer and closer together, until they finally ended up on a bumpy forest path that was little more than a trail in the undergrowth. The cabin emerged from the darkness like an apparition from another time. It was built of dark wood, with small windows and a crooked chimney. No light penetrated outside, no sign of life. But as soon as Jonas unlocked the door, the interior came to life. A kerosene lamp was lit, beer bottles were taken out of a cooler, and music began to play softly from an old radio. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A large wooden table stood in the middle, surrounded by chairs and a worn-out couch. Yellowed hunting trophies hung on the walls, the heads of deer and wild boars staring down at those present with empty eyes. The smell of old wood, smoke and beer hung heavy in the air. Ayana sat down on the edge of the couch and took the bottle Sebastian handed her. She drank, even though she didn't really like alcohol. But here, she had to play along if she didn't want to be labeled an outsider. The men began to tell stories. Stories of arrests that didn't appear in the reports, of suspects who had stumbled before getting into the car, of evidence that disappeared when necessary. They laughed loudly, patted each other on the back, and their voices grew louder with every beer. Ayana laughed along with them, Even though her laughter sounded hollow, she had learned to hide her true feelings, because deep inside her burned something she couldn't show anyone. An anger that had been growing inside her for 2 years, ever since the day her younger brother Malik didn't come home. Malik had been 19, a gentle boy who loved music and dreamed of becoming a sound engineer. He had been out in Freiburg late at night when he was stopped by a patrol car. The official version was that he had resisted arrest. The police officers had been forced to use force. It had been an accident. A tragic incident. Malik had died from his injuries before the ambulance arrived. No charges were brought. The officers involved were transferred, but that was all. Ayana had read the reports, seen the photos, heard the statements, and she knew there was no truth in them. Malik's body had shown signs of blows that went far beyond what would have been necessary in self-defense, but no one wanted to listen. Her mother had cried, her father had remained silent, and Ayana had decided that tears would change nothing. She had applied to the police, not because she believed in the system, but because she wanted to understand how it worked. She wanted to learn the language, the codes, the unwritten rules that allowed people like Malik to die without anyone being held accountable. And then she came across the names. 4 names that appeared in an internal report that should have been sealed. Jonas Müller, Sebastian Weber, Felix Hoffmann, Tobias Keller. The same men who were now sitting around her, laughing and drinking and feeling safe in their little world of camaraderie and impunity. When she had been transferred to Waldkirch, she had known it was no coincidence. She had pulled strings, used contacts, spread rumors. She had presented herself as the perfect colleague, hard-working, loyal, willing to turn a blind eye. And she had waited. She had waited 8 months, buried her anger deep inside, smiled when she was screaming inside. And now she was here, in this cabin, surrounded by the men who had killed her brother. They didn't know it. They had forgotten Malik's face, if they had ever noticed it in the first place. To them, he had been just one of many, a name in a report, a statistic. But to Ayana, he had been everything. The hours passed, the bottles emptied, the jokes grew dirtier, the atmosphere thicker. Felix began telling stories about women he had arrested, about the way he had searched them, about the power he had felt in doing so. The others laughed. Ayana forced herself to laugh along, but her fingers clawed around the beer bottle in her hand. She sensed something changing in the air. The looks they gave her were no longer friendly. They were hungry. Jonas stood up and moved behind her. His hands rested heavily on her shoulders. "You've really become one of us, Ayana," he said quietly. His voice sounded oily, dangerous. "But you know, there's one last test." She froze. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Well, what kind of test?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Sebastian grinned, Felix leaned forward, and Tobias stared at her with a look that wavered between desire and unease. "We share everything here," Jonas said. "That's our rule, and tonight we're sharing you." The words hung in the air like poison. Ayana felt her stomach churn, panic rising inside her, but she didn't show it. Instead, she smiled, slowly, calculatingly. "Of course," she said quietly. "I'm part of this, right?" The men relaxed. They had gotten her consent, or at least that's how they interpreted it. What they didn't know was that Ayana had stopped drinking hours ago. Her bottle had been full, but its contents had flowed into a plant pot, into the sink, everywhere except her body. She was completely sober. Her mind was clear, her pulse calm, her determination absolute. The men began to move around her like predators around their prey. But in Ayana's head, a different movie was playing. She saw Malik's face in front of her, his smile, the way he always sang her name when he came home. She thought of the scars on his body, her mother's tears, her father's silence. and she thought of the small pistol tucked into her jacket, the jacket that hung carelessly over a chair just a few feet away. She had brought it with her, even though it was against all the rules. She had loaded it, oiled it, prepared it. Tonight, she would not be the victim. Tonight, she would be the judge. The clock ticked on. The night grew deeper, and in the small hut in the Black Forest, a plan that had been 2 years in the making was reaching its final stage. Ayana Kone, the sister, the daughter, the policewoman, the hunter, waited. And while the men believed they were in control, she knew they had already lost. Morning would come, and when it did, only shadows and silence would remain. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting distorted shadows on the wooden walls of the cabin. Ayana sat motionless on the couch while the 4 men circled her like wolves, assessing their prey. Jonas still had his hand on her shoulder, the pressure becoming firmer, more possessive. Sebastian poured himself another shot, his eyes shining in the dim light. Felix loosened his belt, a smug grin on his face. Only Tobias hesitated, his gaze uncertain, but too weak to object. "Come on, Ayana," Jonas whispered in her ear, his breath smelling of beer and tobacco. "You wanted to belong. This is the price." She nodded slowly, mechanically, her eyes seemingly empty. But inside her head, a clockwork of calculation and suppressed anger was ticking. She allowed Jonas to pull her up from the sofa, his rough hands sliding over her back. She felt disgust in every cell of her body, but her face remained expressionless. "Have another drink," Sebastian urged, holding out a glass of vodka to her. Ayana took it, brought it to her lips, tilted her head back, but her tongue blocked the passage. The alcohol ran down her cheek, unnoticed in the semi-darkness. She staggered slightly, playing the drunk perfectly. The men laughed. They thought they had won. What followed was a night of humiliation. One after the other, they took what they wanted. Jonas first, brutal and quick. Then Sebastian, who tried to be gentle, as if that would legitimize the violence. Felix treated her like an object, something to use and throw away. Even Tobias, the youngest, finally overcame his hesitation, driven by peer pressure and a false sense of power. They laughed, made jokes, patted each other on the back. For them, it was an initiation, a ritual of masculinity. Ayana endured everything in silence. Every touch burned itself into her memory, every laugh cut like a blade. But she didn't cry, she didn't scream. Instead, she counted. She counted the breaths, the seconds, the minutes. She memorized every detail. Who came first? Who took the longest? Who was the cruelest? This information would serve her well when the time came. Around 4 in the morning, the men began to tire. The alcohol and physical exertion took their toll. Felix was the first to sink onto the couch, his snoring soon filling the room. Sebastian slid to the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. Tobias curled up in a corner, overcome with shame or exhaustion. Only Jonas remained half awake, his eyes fixed on Ayana, suspicious despite his drunkenness. "You stay here," he muttered. "Don't try to run away." Then he too tipped over to one side, consciousness slipping away. Ayana waited. 10 minutes. 20. She didn't move, breathing shallowly, listening to the sounds of the night. The snoring grew deeper, more regular. The men were in a deep sleep, vulnerable, unaware. Slowly, inch by inch, Ayana rose from the dirty floor. Her body ached, but her mind was razor-sharp. She went to the dresser where her jacket lay and pulled out the pistol, a Glock 17, the standard weapon of the German police. She had stolen it months ago from an evidence storage facility and made the serial number unrecognizable. No one would be able to trace it. She checked the magazine. 17 rounds, more than enough. Then she pulled a small, crumpled photo from her pants pocket. Malik's face smiled at her, innocent, alive. She pressed it to her lips. "For you," she whispered. "All for you." Dawn began to color the sky. The first grey light penetrated through the narrow windows of the hut. Ayana stood in the middle of the room, the gun in her hand, looking at the sleeping men. These were the last minutes of their existence, even if they didn't know it. The reckoning had begun. The silence in the hut was absolute, interrupted only by the rhythmic snoring of the four men. Ayana stood motionless in the middle of the room, the gun firmly in her hand. Her heartbeat was calm, controlled. 2 years of preparation had led to this moment. She thought of her mother, who had barely spoken since Malik's death, of her father, whose eyes lost a little more of their sparkle every day, of the justice that had never come. She pointed the gun at Jonas, who was lying on the couch, his mouth open, one hand on his bloated belly. He had been the first to strike, back then with Malik. The reports had obscured it, but Ayana had learned the truth from other sources. Jonas's fist had been the first to hit her brother. His boots had been the last to kick Malik's body. She stepped closer, the barrels just inches from his head. "This is for Malik," she whispered, so quietly that only she could hear it. Then she pulled the trigger. The bang tore through the morning silence like a clap of thunder. Jonas's body twitched once, then lay still. Blood seeped from the wound in his temple, dark and thick, staining the dirty sofa cushion. The other men jumped up. Sebastian rubbed his eyes, confusion on his face. "What the—" His words were cut off when his gaze fell on Ayana, on the gun in her hand, on Jonas's lifeless body. "Ayana, what have you done?" His voice broke, panic replacing sleepiness. She turned to him, her expression blank as a mask. "You killed my brother," she said calmly, almost gently. "Malik Kone, 19 years old. Do you remember?" Sebastian stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was an accident. The second shot hit him square in the chest. He stumbled backward against the wall, his hands clawing at the wound, blood spurting between his fingers. He slowly sank to the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear of death. A gurgling sound escaped his throat, then he too was silent. Felix was already on his feet, his instincts still intact despite the alcohol and shock. He rushed to the door, his bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. "You damn lunatic!" he shouted. Ayana aimed calmly and fired twice. The first shot hit him in the back, the second in the shoulder. Felix fell heavily to the floor, his body twitching, but he was still alive. She walked over to him, stood over him, looked into his pain-contorted eyes. "You treated him like a dog," she said quietly. "You kicked him while he begged for mercy. Did you hear his screams? Did you see his face?" Felix tried to speak, but only blood came out of his mouth. She pressed the barrel against his forehead. "Now you listen." The third shot ended his suffering. Only Tobias remained. He had pushed himself into the far corner of the hut, his hands raised in desperate defense. Tears ran down his face. "Please," he stammered. "Please, Ayana, I tried to stop it. I didn't mean to—" "You were there," she interrupted coldly. "You struck, you watched, you kept silent." She walked slowly toward him. Tobias slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his whole body shaking. "I was young. They forced me. Malik was young too," Ayana said. 19. He had his whole life ahead of him. What is your excuse worth against his life? Tobias broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Ayana stood in front of him. For a moment she hesitated, looking at the broken man in front of her, hearing his remorse. Then she thought of the funeral, of the closed coffin, of not being able to see her brother one last time because his face had been too disfigured. The hesitation disappeared. The last shot echoed through the hut. Silence. Absolute oppressive silence. Ayana stood amid the devastation, surrounded by 4 lifeless bodies. Her hand did not tremble. Her eyes were dry. She felt no relief, No triumph, only a deep, hollow emptiness. Malik was still dead. Nothing would bring him back, but the men who had killed him would never hurt anyone again. She walked over to the table and placed Malik's photo on the bloody surface. Next to it, she placed her service ID card. On the back, she had written in careful handwriting, "For Malik Koneh, 19 years old, the justice the system denied him." The first sunlight broke through the trees and fell through the windows of the cabin. Ayana put on her jacket, tucked her gun away, and stepped out into the morning. The fog had lifted, the birds began to sing. She walked down the forest path without looking back. Behind her lay the end of a story. Ahead of her lay the unknown. At 10:30 in the morning, the first patrol car arrived at the hunting lodge. Chief Inspector Stefan Baumgartner, a man in his late 50s with deep wrinkles and tired eyes, got out of the vehicle and breathed in the cool forest air. He was here because of a routine report. Jonas Müller had not reported for duty, nor had the other three. Their cell phones were turned off. That was unusual enough to warrant a check. The door of the cabin was ajar. A metallic smell wafted out, which Baumgartner recognized immediately. He had 20 years of experience with the Criminal Investigation Department, and this smell never meant anything good. "Stay here," he ordered the two young officers who had accompanied him. He drew his service weapon and entered cautiously. What he saw made him freeze for a moment. 4 bodies lay scattered around the room, each with fatal gunshot wounds. The walls were covered with blood splatters. On the table lay a service ID card and a photo of a young man. Baumgartner forced himself to remain professional, even though his stomach was turning. He knew these men. He had worked with them, drunk beer with them, laughed at bad jokes with them. He stepped closer to the table, avoiding touching anything. The ID card belonged to Ayana Koneh. He remembered her, the new colleague, quiet, competent, perhaps a little too reserved. And the photo. He turned it over and read the back. His hands began to shake. Malik Koneh. The name rang a bell. A case from 2 years ago, a young man who had died during a routine check. There had been an internal investigation which had been quickly settled. No charges, no consequences. Baumgartner reached for his radio. "This is Chief Inspector Baumgartner. I need the forensic team at the hunting lodge near Waldkirch immediately. We have 4 dead." His voice was calm, but his thoughts were racing. He already understood what had happened here, even if he didn't want to admit it yet. This was no ordinary murder. This was retaliation. Within an hour, the cabin was cordoned off. Forensic technicians in white suits moved through the crime scene, taking photographs, collecting evidence, marking bloodstains. The bodies were placed in black bags and taken away. Baumgartner stood outside watching the commotion, a cigarette in his hand that he did not light. A young colleague approached him. "Chief Inspector, we found the bullet casings, 9mm, standard ammunition, and there are no signs of a struggle. The victims were shot in their sleep or immediately after waking up." The young man hesitated. "It looks like an execution." Baumgartner nodded slowly. "Do we have any trace of Ayana Koneh?" His colleague shook his head. "Nothing. Her car is still at the station. Her cell phone is turned off. She's disappeared." The chief inspector sighed deeply. "Then we'll look for her. Nationwide, but discreetly. I don't want the press to get wind of this before we know what really happened." But the discretion didn't last long. By the afternoon, local reporters had learned of the incident. By evening, it was the top story throughout Baden-Württemberg. 4 police officers dead, colleague under suspicion. The headlines exploded. TV crews parked in front of the police station in Waldkirch. Journalists besieged Baumgartner with questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer. Then someone started digging. A young reporter named Lisa Hartmann, who worked for a national newspaper, came across the name Malik Koneh. She found the old reports, the witness statements, the photos of the injuries. She conducted interviews with Malik's parents, with neighbors, with people who had seen something that night. Her articles changed the narrative. "Revenge or justice?" asked her headline. She described Malik as a harmless young man who'd been brutally abused by 4 police officers. She quoted the autopsy, which had never been made public. She mentioned the internal investigation that had been closed within days. And she asked the question that everyone was now asking: was Ayana Kone a murderer or a sister who did what the system was unwilling to do? Public opinion was divided. Demonstrations began in front of the Freiburg Regional Court. Some demanded Ayana's arrest, calling her a cold-blooded killer, a traitor to the police force. Others carried signs with Malik's face on them, chanting, "No justice, no peace." On social media, Ayana became a symbolic figure, a hero to some, a monster to others. Baumgartner sat in his office and looked at the growing file on his desk. He reread Lisa's article and studied the photos of Malik she had published. Then he opened the original report on Malik's death. The discrepancies were obvious once you looked closely. The injuries didn't match the story. The witness statements were contradictory. All of this had been swept under the rug because it was easier, because it protected the reputation of the police. He stubbed out the cigarette he had finally lit and picked up his phone. It was time to call in the State Bureau of Investigation. This was no longer a local case. This was a scandal that called the entire system into question. And somewhere out there was Ayana Kone, vanished like a ghost, while the world debated her fate. 3 weeks after the murders in the hunting lodge, Ayana Kone had disappeared into thin air. No trace, no sighting, no digital signature. Her bank account remained untouched, her apartment in Waldkirch abandoned, as if she had never lived there. The State Criminal Police Office had set up a special commission with 20 officers working day and night on the case. Wanted posters with her face were hung at every train station and every highway rest stop. But Ayana remained invisible. Chief Inspector Baumgartner reluctantly led the investigation. The deeper he dug, the more questions arose. He had visited Malik's parents in their small apartment in Freiburg. The mother, a petite woman with grey hair, had cried, but not for the dead police officers. "My son was a good boy," she had said over and over again. "They treated him like dirt." And then they lied. The father had remained silent, his eyes empty and broken. Baumgartner had also spoken to former colleagues of Jonas, Sebastian, Felix, and Tobias. Most of them dutifully defended the dead, talking about camaraderie and fulfilling their duty. But some, especially the younger officers, spoke more quietly, more cautiously. "There were rumors," said one, "about the meetings in the cabin, about things that happened there. Nobody talked about it, but everyone knew." Another added, "Jonas and the others, they weren't the good guys they pretended to be." The media had long since turned Ayana into a legend. Graffiti artists sprayed her likeness on walls in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich. Always the same image: a woman with a determined look, a gun in one hand, Malik's photo in the other. Below it, slogans such as "Justice knows no uniform" or "She did what the system couldn't." T-shirts were printed, hashtags trended on Twitter: "Justice for Malik," "Ayana Kone," "System failure." But there were also dissenting voices. Police unions demanded tougher penalties for cop killers. Conservative politicians used the case to preach about law and order. "Vigilante justice must never be tolerated," the Interior Minister declared at a press conference. "Ayana Kone is a murderer, not a hero." But his words were lost in a sea of divided opinions. Then on the 26th day after the crime, something unexpected happened. Every police station in Baden-Württemberg received an identical envelope. No sender, no stamp, simply slipped through the letter slots as if someone had come by during the night. Inside were documents, internal reports, encrypted emails, witness statements that had never been recorded. Evidence of systematic misconduct, not only in the Malik case, but in dozens of other cases over the last 10 years. Baumgartner sat in his office staring at the pages in front of him. There were names of judges who had suppressed evidence, names of prosecutors who had dropped cases, names of high-ranking police officers who had sabotaged investigations. The entire system had been compromised, and Ayana had documented it. She wasn't just an avenger. She was a whistleblower. The documents quickly ended up in the hands of the press. Lisa Hartman, the journalist who had already written about Malik, published a multi-part report. "The System That Broke Ayana Kone" was the headline. She showed how corruption and camaraderie had undermined the justice system, how victims had been silenced, how families had been left without answers. The scandal spread. Resignations followed. The Freiburg police chief resigned. 3 judges were suspended. A state parliament commission of inquiry was set up. The public demanded answers, and the system that had remained silent for so long began to crumble. But there was still no trace of Ayana herself. Some claimed to have seen her abroad, in Paris, in Amsterdam, even in Morocco. Others swore she had taken her own life somewhere in the depths of the Black Forest. Still others believed she was living in hiding in Germany, watching from the shadows as her revelations destroyed the system that had killed her brother. Baumgartner wasn't sure what to believe, but one night, as he sat late in his office, he found a small note on his desk that hadn't been there before. Just a few words, in neat handwriting. "Thank you for not burying the truth. A.K." His heart raced. He ran to the window and looked down at the empty parking lot. No one, only shadows and silence. He folded the note and put it in his pocket. He wouldn't report it. Some truths had to remain hidden. Ayana Kone was more than a suspect. She had become a symbol, a question that had no easy answer. And perhaps, Baumgartner thought, that was exactly how it should be. Outside, it began to rain. The city slept, but its stories remained awake. Somewhere, beyond the sirens and headlines, Ayana Kone lived on, as a person, as a myth, as a reminder of a system that had failed. Morning would come, as it always did, but nothing would ever be the same again. 6 months had passed since that night in the Black Forest. Winter had Waldkirch firmly in its grip. Snow covered the streets and muffled every sound. The city had changed, but not for the better. Mistrust hung in the air like fog. Police officers were harassed in the streets. Citizens refused to make statements. Trust in the institutions was broken. The State Parliament's Investigative Commission had submitted its report. 38 cases of police violence in the last 10 years, at least 12 of them fatal. In every case, the investigations had been closed or evidence destroyed. Names were named, careers ended, charges brought. The system cleansed itself, too late for the victims, but perhaps in time for the future. Chief Inspector Baumgartner had resigned from the force. He could no longer work in a system whose rottenness he now knew. On his last day, he was clearing out his office when Lisa Hartman, the journalist, visited him. "Did you ever find out where she is?" she asked quietly. Baumgartner shook his head. "No, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know." Lisa nodded sympathetically. "Do you think she's still alive?" "I think she's what we made her," he replied. "A ghost, an idea. Maybe that's more powerful than being alive." Lisa smiled sadly. "Your last article about her had over 5 million views. People want to believe that someone will fight back when the system fails. They need this story." In Freiburg, Malik's parents visited his grave for the first time in months. Snow lay thick on the cemetery, but fresh flowers lay on the stone. Roses, carnations, lilies, dozens of bouquets from people Malik had never known. One note read, "You will not be forgotten. Your sister made sure of that." The mother cried, but this time the tears were different. Not just pain, but something like comfort. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" she asked her husband. He gazed into the distance beyond the snow-covered gravestones. "No," he said quietly, "but maybe she doesn't have to. She did what she had to do. Now she has to live with herself." The mother nodded and placed a single white rose on Malik's grave. "I hope she finds peace, wherever she is." Far away from Freiburg, in a small coastal town in Portugal, a woman sat in a cafe and gazed out at the sea. Her hair was now short and dyed blonde, her skin tanned by the sun. She called herself Maria, worked in a bookstore, and spoke fluent Portuguese. No one recognized her as the woman whose face had haunted the German media for months. Ayana Kone, or the person she once was, drank her coffee and read an old German newspaper that someone had left behind in the cafe. The headline reported on reforms in the police system, new control mechanisms, justice that may have come too late, but had come nonetheless. She folded the newspaper and put it aside. She often thought about that night, about the faces of the men, about the moment she pulled the trigger, about the silence that followed. She had no regrets, but she felt no relief either. Revenge was not a cure, just a band-aid on a wound that would never fully heal. Malik remained dead. Her family remained broken, but maybe, just maybe, another child would be spared because she had done what she had done. In the evenings she walked on the beach, the waves lapping at her bare feet. The ocean was endless, indifferent to human suffering and human justice. She pulled a small, laminated photo from her pocket, Malik smiling, forever 19. "I did it, brother," she whispered to the wind. "I don't know if it was right, but I did it for you." She didn't bury the photo, didn't burn it. She kept it, an anchor to a past she could never let go of. Then she turned and walked back to her small apartment, where a new life awaited her, a life without a name, without a history, without a future that extended beyond the next day. In Germany, the discussions continued. Was Ayana Kone a murderer or a martyr? Had she been right, or had she broken the law? The answers remained as divided as society itself. But one thing was certain: her name would not be forgotten. It would be quoted in courtrooms, discussed in universities, preserved in the hearts of those who believed in justice, even if it lay outside the system. Dawn broke over the Atlantic, golden and mercilessly beautiful. Ayana stood at the window and watched the sun touch the horizon. A new day began, as it always did. But she would never be the same person again. The dawn had transformed her, from a sister to an avenger, from a police officer to a hunted woman, from a human being to a legend. And as the world continued to turn, one question remained unanswered. What was justice really worth if it could only be bought with blood? Ayana didn't know the answer. She only knew that she had done what had to be done, and that she would have to live with that for the rest of her days. The wind carried the sound of the waves to her. Somewhere in another life, she could have been happy, but that life was over. All that remained was the echo of that night in the Black Forest, and the quiet certainty that some wounds never heal, no matter how many sunrises you experience.